And so we want a lot less tree cover for quail than we do for deer or turkey. We want a lot of brush cover for quail. We need some, but not as much for deer and turkey. We can tolerate a lot more woodland for deer and turkey than we can for quail. So, you know, that's why it's so important to figure out what you're managing for. And then you need to think about, you look at your landscape, what's limiting my population out there? Is it shrubs? Is it trees? Is it brood cover? Is it nesting cover? And then that's going to start dictating our burn descriptions. When we burn, how we burn. Like this area that was burned here was pretty clean. There was just a few patches that didn't burn. If we wanted more of those patches, say we wanted to do a bigger burn unit, because it's more practical to burn 200 acres than it is a whole bunch of 10, 20 acre places, then we might have made this prescription where we burn earlier in the day in the growing season, and we might have burned it with a little higher humidity, lower wind, and we would have created more of those. If we wanted it to burn like a moonscape, we would have done low humidity with a pretty good wind and a good fuel load in the afternoon, and everything would have burned out here. You know, so we can play with that prescription, both on the size and what we end up with. And I think it's real important with whatever our landscape needs to be. Not only are we trying to increase the part that's limiting, we want to create a diversity out there. You know, deer don't eat on bread alone, just like we don't. You know, they need a variety of foods out there. And we want to burn at different seasons, different frequencies. I mean, I don't even recommend, if deer is my target, not so much quail, but if deer is my target, I wouldn't burn 100% of my landscape. I'd probably keep some percentage, 5 to 15%, that's rarely burned, you know, and the other parts might be burned every 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, because I'm gonna get different plant communities with those different deals. With deer, I want these different mixes of shrubs and woody vines and trees and forbs. And you know, a lot of people think of deer as browsers, and they are, because they have to be in the wintertime, but if they had a choice, they'd eat a forb first. You know, a weed, if you don't know what a forb is. And the most important group of forbs for deer are legumes. And the best thing we can do to stimulate legumes is fire. If you're familiar with the legumes, you'll get a lot more response from partridge pea and wild bean and tick clover after a burn than in an unburned area. You have a lot more biomass and frequency of those things in the landscape. So we need to burn. I mean, it's absolutely essential if you're managing any of these native wildlife species in native ecosystems here, on upland ecosystems particularly. I can't think of a single native species that doesn't need some fire in Oklahoma. But some, like maybe a box turtle or a glass lizard, we would burn less frequently and less intensely than we would for some of these game animals. So, but most of us are managing these game animals. So, and I'll let you go on from there.
So, Mike brought up potentially fire-sensitive species. That's a concern a lot of people have, is like, are there species that can be directly killed by fire? Yeah, but it's rare. And most of them that I encounter are reptiles. So snakes, especially glass lizards, which aren't, I don't know if you ever caught a glass lizard, they're not very mobile. They can't escape fire very easily, especially in the spring when they're cool. Box turtles are another one. But with those species, almost all the mortality we see is in the last 2 weeks of March and the first 2 weeks of April. It's very constrained to that period when they're coming out of emergence in the early spring. They're not very mobile yet. They're cold. Later in the year, July and August and September, I personally have never found a box turtle mortality during that period. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's unusual. In fact, I'm on a graduate project at the University of Tennessee right now, and 90% of all the mortalities of box turtles during that project were from fire. But 90% of those were from March-April fire. And they burned all year long. But they had almost no mortality the rest of the time of the year. Now, does that mean you should never burn during March and April? No, it does not mean that. It just means that we probably shouldn't burn the whole state during March and April. As much as we can spread our fire out, it's going to benefit different species differently, because they all have different ecology, they all have different habitat requirements. So when we get stuck in a rut and we're burning, you know, a 20,000 acre wildlife management area, we're burning all of it always during the month of March, that's probably going to benefit some things. It's going to be detrimental to other species. So if you want a diverse wildlife community, you need to have a diverse portfolio of fire prescriptions on your property. Mike mentioned quail and the trade-off between forest cover and brushy prairie. Quail don't have to have any trees. They can tolerate some trees, so you can have a very open woodland or savanna and have bobwhite, but they don't need it. And those of you that hunt in western Oklahoma know what I'm talking about. High quail density, not a tree in sight. Quail are shrub obligates. They're not a grassland bird. I know we call them that, but that's wrong. You don't find many quail in Osage County because there's no shrubs. You find quail where there's a lot of shrub cover, and there's probably going to be grasses there too, and they use those for different things, but they really have to have the shrub cover. And in the forested area, like cross timbers, a question that gets brought up a lot, if I want quail, how much of my tree cover do I have to remove before I have them? Because a lot of people don't want to remove all their cross timbers. They value the aesthetics, they value white-tailed deer, they value forest songbirds, whatever. So how much of the tree cover do you think you would have to remove before quail would show up? Anybody want to guess? Not quite that much. You have to get the canopy down to at least 60% before quail will even be on the landscape. And that's not a huntable population. That's like 1 covey or 2 covey a day maybe, okay? To guarantee you have quail, you'll have to take out about half the overstory. Most unmanaged cross timber forests in Oklahoma and Texas have about 80 to 90% canopy closure. You're gonna have to take half that out before you have enough quail that you'd even want to think about having a bird dog. And that's not gonna be maximum numbers of quail. That's just a few coveys. So a lot of trees have to be taken out, more than some landowners feel comfortable with.
I don't know how well it translates here. I mean, that's talking about the presence of quail in the landscape. If you're wanting to optimize quail in the landscape, at least in tall timbers down there, they were showing that 17 square feet of basal area was the threshold where trees started to decrease quail numbers. That's not many trees. That's pretty low. So that's with the hardwoods. With less woody cover, which is pretty common in a lot of cross timbers for quail, we need to burn a lot. I'd want to be burning 40 to 60% of my land every year, and I'd burn the other part next year that wouldn't burn this year. And you're going to get your quail response on the burn acres this year. That it doesn't carry over to next year. They're going to be on the burned areas now that was burned this year, and then where they're going to be where it's burned next year, the bulk of your quail population. It's an immediate response. A lot of it has to do with thatched layer. And I'm talking in ungrazed situations here, but we found that they were only on the burn site the year of the burn. It didn't carry over 1 year past that on an ungrazed situation. Most places have cattle, so it's going to be a little different response. But turkeys cover a lot of area in one day. So, the turkeys are going to come to feed into display and to mate on the burned areas. But they still need roost, which is going to be mature trees that aren't burned, often in a riparian area. So that's one area that we're going to burn seldom, if any, if we're trying to maintain those roost trees. And then the rest of the land, they're going to need some areas that have old grass, last year's grass or thick grass cover that we're sure not going to burn this spring if we want, nesting in those areas. So that's, again, getting back to diversity. We don't want a moonscape on our whole 1,000-acre ranch. We're going to burn less frequently in the bottomlands if we're talking turkeys, maybe never, depending. We may have to, if we're getting cedar invasion, we may have to do some. And we're going to burn the upland parts in some type of rotation where we have burned and unburned areas. And I'd probably have some of it burned in August, September to create optimum brood habitat for the next spring. So I mean, we'd have a blend of burning there on that landscape.
The important part is just to have a variable structure, so variable time since fire on the property, because even in a given day, a wild turkey might use 3 or 4 different time since fires for different needs that it has. And trying to have those in somewhat close proximity. I mean, turkeys they cover a lot more ground than quail do in a day, but I want roost cover close to good brood cover. The study we just completed at Pack Saddle, we found that while turkeys spent the vast majority of the day in open herbaceous areas, they virtually never went more than 200 meters from tree cover. They just kind of fed out in the open areas, but they stayed fairly close to tree cover. And it wasn't just because they were tied to that for the roost site. They were actually bouncing back and forth all day to stay cool. So when they got too hot, they would go in the shade of the trees and cool off. Then they would come back out and feed, and they just did that all day long. So having some variability across the landscape, those trees spread out as much as possible, would be really beneficial for something like a wild turkey.
That 200 meter or 200 yard issue is pretty critical on deer too. There were some studies done in Texas that showed that where they had solid brush cover, I'm talking 90% coverage or something, we're talking South Texas type brush cover, they were trying to find out how wide the openings could be before we started impacting deer abundance. And when those openings reached 200 yard thresholds, when they went past that, it started decreasing deer density. Up to that point, it had no impact. It improved deer initially, up to some threshold, and then some threshold had no impact. Once the openings started getting larger than 200 yards across in one dimension, you started decreasing deer abundance. So that's pretty important, that talking about juxtaposition of the woody cover relative to the open areas. And on quail, we want a shrubby cover within 50 yards or less everywhere if you want to optimize quail. I mean, you start getting 200 yards, that's outside quail range. You're going to have a lot of your property unusable by quail if you got 200 yard openings. So again, it gets back to the species that you're focusing on.
Yeah, that's really important. If your average shrub patch distance between shrub patches is 200 yards, as Mike said, that doesn't mean you can't have a lot of quail. It just means you don't have as many quail as you otherwise could have. If you're trying to have the maximum number of quail on your property, think about how far a quail will fly. It wants to get to shrub cover to hide, so they generally want to fly less than 100 yards. So if your shrub patches are further than that apart, there's areas of your property that probably never get used by bobwhite, which means you're not carrying as many bobwhite as you potentially could.
Can't throw a baseball and hit a brush pile.
Yeah, Dale Rollins uses that analogy a lot in Texas, and I think it's actually a really good one. If you can, throw a softball and you can't reach the next shrub patch, it's not optimum for quail. Not every study has shown this, but the studies that have found a season of difference, or a season of fire difference, tend to show that late summer has the most abundant forb response, the best forb response. So July, August, September. Some studies find no difference between season of burn, but usually if they found a difference, July, August, and September yielded the most forbs, which all things being equal is probably going to mean the most pollinating insects. Now there are insects that are grass specific. There's a whole group of grasshoppers that only feed on grasses. But in general, there's more insects in really rich, diverse forb flowering plant communities. So if you want lots of pollinators, I would absolutely be burning in late summer. But more than that, I would just burn at different times of the year because that will favor different plants and different pollinators. Specific for monarch, maybe a little earlier than August, September, probably July, early August, yeah, to give that milkweed and the monarchs enough time to complete. I don't know how late you could go, but I know the mowing plots they've done, I think they're recommending mid-July. Is that right, Dustin?
And what I've seen too, just doing some of my own, basically if you get past into later July, early August, if they've already come up, set seed, they're typically not going to resprout again as well. Okay.
And that's milkweed, but Dr. Goodman's going to talk about on the season of burn plots. We've seen that with other plants too. Plants like scurf pea. We find with scurf pea, we keep scurf pea going all summer in those plots because they're burned at different times of the year, which normally we think of scurf pea is kind of finishing up its life cycle about right now, and it's gone for the rest of the year. But we found when we burn in the summer, scurf pea will come back again. And so some of these forbs that we think of as kind of ephemeral, that we only see them in May or June, some of that has to do with disturbance patterns. If you change the disturbance pattern, you can actually change the phenology of that plant. And that can be really important for some plants and insects that are tied to that plant. Well, depending on how you burn, when you burn, you can increase your livestock production. On warm season grasses, our research has shown that unburned warm season grass generally has a crude protein content of between 4 and 8%, below the protein content that just to maintain livestock. Burned native warm season grasses usually have between 16 and 20% crude protein. So what that translates to for livestock, is if I had cows, I'd want to be burning as often as I could to keep those animals on a high nutritional plane throughout the entire season. Here on the patch burn pastures that y'all will talk about later, they've been able to eliminate about a month of protein supplementation in the winter by burning during multiple seasons. That's worth a lot for cattle.